Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 343 of the Juicebox Podcast. This episode of the show is sponsored by Omnipod. You can get a free, no-obligation demo of the Omnipod tubeless insulin pump sent directly to you by going to myomnipod.com/juicebox. Imagine this for a second. You're at your home, the mail comes, and in that mail is the insulin pump that you've been dreaming of. The tubeless insulin pump that you've been dreaming of. No wires, no tubing, just this little Omnipod. And you're going to try it on and wear it for a couple of days to see how you like it. Once you've done that, you can reach back out to Omnipod and say, this is amazing, I want to keep going, or you don't want to keep going with Omnipod. No harm, no foul. No one's going to bother you. No obligation, no cost to you to try that demo pod. So why don't you give it a shot, right? There's absolutely no reason not to. The show is also sponsored today by the Contour Next One blood glucose meter. The Contour Next One meter is absolutely, without a doubt, the best glucose meter my daughter has ever used. Next month, Arden will have had diabetes for 14 years, and the Contour Next One is, without a doubt, the most accurate, easy to use, genuinely lovely little blood sugar meter that Arden has ever had. I love the second chance test strips, which, happen all the time. You think you're going to get enough blood with that first drop and you don't. You have to go back and get more. You can do that with the Contour Next One without wasting a test strip. You know what I'm talking about. You think you've got enough blood and you don't. It's weird that it happens when this meter needs such a little bit to begin with. But just once in a while, you see a little red, you're like, I've got it. You put the lance down, you give a little squeeze, and then nothing comes out, and you're just like, and it won't. But you think, this is enough, and you touch it, and it's not enough. You're like, oh, all right. You squeeze again, look at it, you finally get some more out. That whole thing. Don't waste a test strip with the Contour Next One when that happens. We all know it happens. It's great not to have to waste a test strip when it does. ContourNext1.com. Get there, because at the top of the page, there's a link to hit, and you may be eligible for an absolutely free meter. And if you're not, and you still want to upgrade your meter game, just ask your doctor. They'll throw you a little prescription, and you'll be on your way with the Contour Next One. And we're also sponsored by Touched by Type 1. Check out touchedbytype1.org to see what this amazing organization is doing for people living with type 1 diabetes. It'll only take you a few minutes, but once you get there, you might stay a little longer. When you're checking out their programs, some of the things they've done in the past, look at the kids that they're helping, and the ways that they're trying to support a search for a cure. This really might be up your alley. Touchedbytype1.org. And of course, Dexcom, makers of the G6 continuous glucose monitor. The data that comes back from the Dexcom G6 is at the core of how we help our daughter with type 1 diabetes. Honestly, it's how a lot of people listening to this podcast are getting their data. That data that is so important for making decisions about temp basal increases and decreases, extended boluses for foods like pizza or Chinese food, helping you to cut off low blood sugars before they happen. Is your blood sugar always high and you think it's your basal insulin but you can't tell? Dexcom will show you if that's true. Always too much basal insulin, you're always fighting a low? Again, you'll be able to see that on your Dexcom. You're going to be able to see everything, and it is life-changing. Being able to share your blood sugars with loved ones anywhere in the world with iPhone and Android. Just imagine that. Your sister in... Where do I want to pretend your sister lives today? Hold on. Where did I say last time? Ooh, your sister in Kissimmee, Florida, right? She's got the diabetes, but she's living alone. She wants somebody to have her back a little bit. That could be you. You're all the way up in Anchorage, Alaska. You know Alaska. Sled dogs, a lot of cold, a lot of dark. Anyway, you live there. Your sister's in Kissimmee. Her blood sugar starts heading down. She doesn't notice. You get a little beep, beep, beep on your phone. You give her your sister a phone call. You're like, hey, what's her name going to be? Kathy. Hey, Kathy, your blood sugar's getting low. And she's like, oh my God, it's you. I love you. And you're like, yeah, we're sisters. And then her blood sugar never gets low. She didn't notice, but you did. Imagine that if it's your child at school or your sister in Kissimmee. That's amazing. That's Dexcom Share and Follow. Dexcom's going to give you the speed and direction that your blood sugar is moving in real time. Constant. You hear that word, continuous glucose monitors, because you're getting that data continuously. It's a game changer. Please trust me. Find out more at dexcom.com/juicebox. Actually, you can find out about all of the sponsors and the links you need to find them right there in the show notes of your podcast player. And if you can't, for some reason, you're using some like 900-year-old Android phone or something like that, and you can't click on them, they're right there at juiceboxpodcast.com. I'm not leaving you hanging. I'll get you there. All right, let's talk about John Welsh for a second. John has type 1 diabetes. He's a physician, and he works at Dexcom. And he's on the show today because I reached out to Dexcom and said, I want to drill down deep. I want to understand granularly the way smart people understand. What is standard deviation? And I know that might be like, you're like, oh my God, that's what this episode is about. But no, listen to me. What we're going to talk about today, standard deviation. We're really going to understand what it is and how they come to those numbers. We're also going to talk about coefficient of variation. Now, there's a lot of words you don't know, but by the end of this, you're going to understand. And you're going to understand why it's so important for you living with type 1 diabetes. After we get all this information into our heads, I started talking to John a little bit about how does he manage? What does he call success at the end of the day? And it wasn't as much about the numbers as you might think, but he really helped me to understand what these words that, maybe don't make sense to us right away, just lay people, what they mean and how they're helping. It used to be all about A1C, right? You tell people like, keep your A1C here. This is what you have to do. But then all of a sudden you start hearing people talk about standard deviation and variability. And this is going to help you to understand it even more. I had such a good time talking to John that it got away from me. I was supposed to talk to him for an hour, and like an hour and 20 minutes into it, I was like, oh my God, I got to let you go. He was like 4 minutes away from having to go to another meeting. And I was just like, oh, I'm sorry, go. I found this incredibly interesting. I hope you do too, because I really believe that the concepts that John and I spoke about today are at the core. They're the basis, the bedrock of how you should be considering your health with type 1 diabetes. If you're looking for data to tell you how you're doing, these three things are a huge piece. You'll see. Please remember while you're listening that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Please always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. I wanted to call this episode Sugar Adam, but anyway, you'll find out why. Here's my finding. And I've been at this like quite some time, being around the diabetes space, I guess. And when the powers that be, whoever they be, decide that we should all be aiming for a lower A1C, there's a way to disseminate that information. They pull together, industry people, and they give them the talks. Like, here's why A1C should be here and not here, and here's what we've learned. And you get that talk, and then those people find different stakeholders and influencers, and they spread the word. And before you know it, when it's distilled out to the public, the message is simply, the ADA decided that your A1C should be this now. And that's what you're now going to hear your doctors talking about, like it's, like it's a rule handed down from up high. They have a different opinion. And if you don't pay attention, you don't realize that that's just how we get information out to people, right? There's no good way. You can't call everybody in the world and say, hey, by the way, your A1C should be a little lower now. You do this. But often while we're spreading that information, it lacks real context. And when this happened recently, I'm going to guess in the last 2 years, when all of a sudden you started hearing your endocrinologist tell you, listen, it's really much more about variability, your standard deviation. And they started talking like that. There was no context with it again. And then suddenly everyone's just, they're walking around like they've learned something. And they say, A1C is not as important as standard deviation. And then all of a sudden the message becomes A1C is not important. And then it gets, you know what I mean? Like it gets ruined as people oversimplify things. And so I really want to leave this talk just backwards and forwards understanding standard deviation. And when I reached out to Dexcom, I said, I need someone who can really do that, and no pressure, but they said it was you. So
I guess, if you looked around Dexcom, you would say, all right, we need somebody who can tell stories, who can talk in a straight line, more or less. And my just by way of introduction, my job title is medical and scientific writer. So I love a good story, and I love especially the stories that have to do with numbers and stories that try to convince people that the truth is actually true. And numbers can really buttress a story. You say, hey, look what happens if you don't save for retirement. Here's one way you could go if you spend your money in Las Vegas on that gambling table versus spending your money in an IRA or whatever. So the idea that you can make convincing arguments with numerical data has always been attractive to me, and that's why I did some residency training. I went to medical school, went to graduate school, and after medical school, I did residency training in laboratory medicine. And laboratory medicine is all about measuring things and saying, oh, you've got an abnormal value on one of your lab results, and here's why it matters, and here's what you should do to mitigate the risk of, for example, having a really high potassium level. So if you have good data, then you can make persuasive arguments and you can change people's behavior, hopefully keep them out of trouble. In the case of a high or low potassium, you could save their life. Yeah. If you get the doctors to intervene in the case of some really abnormal lab value that might come up in the hospital context. The bigger question about glucose values and standard deviation, we can get to that, but you made the broader point about public health recommendations, and man, we are just right in the middle of public health recommendations with the pandemic, because there's a lot of uncertainty, which is, gosh, how can I go to the concert? Can I go to the restaurant? Can I go outside without wearing a mask? And that the recommendations that we've been getting from public health authorities have been a little bit discombobulated, maybe internally inconsistent, and kind of frustrating at times. But I'm with you, though. The idea that we can provide good evidence-based recommendations with respect to goals in managing diabetes is a big interest of mine. I'm all about the numbers.
Well, many years ago, I came to the conclusion for my daughter that if I get what I expect is what I started thinking of it as. I realized I had Arden's high line set at 200, and I always kept her under 200. So one day I moved her to 180, and I was like, oh, I always keep her under 180. This is really interesting. So I kept pushing it down, and now my daughter's range is 65 to 120. And mostly we keep it in there. And when we don't, it doesn't go that far out, right? It'll go to 150. That's usually, like just now, I'll use this morning as an example, 2 slices of toast, an avocado, butter, and an orange. And her blood sugar went to 148, and it's coming back now. And it's not over a long period of time. Yeah, it's beautiful, right? And so, but her standard deviation will look bigger than someone else's. And I don't know if I'm making up things in my head, or like, how is it possible that Arden can have a life like that, but her standard deviation could be higher than someone whose A1C is a point or two bigger than hers, and who have swings that are far higher and last longer? And so that's the one idea that keeps me focused on, I don't understand standard deviation or not. And then when I start talking about it with the people that listen to the show, I come to realize that everyone's sort of got that confusion. So can we start very oversimply, and standard deviation as an idea is a mathematical issue. Is that right?
Oh, it is. It's a number that is used to describe a set of numbers. So for the case of folks who are using CGM, you might expect up to 288 numbers every day. And each number represents a glucose concentration. And you can use words to describe that set of numbers, or you can use numbers to describe that set of numbers. The average is a pretty simple number that it's easy to calculate. You would add up those 288 values and then divide by 288. And then you get the mean. In this case, it's the arithmetic mean. There's other flavors. There's the geometric and the harmonic mean, but we'll leave those aside for now. But the arithmetic mean tells you it's a measure of central tendency, where you might expect the average, if there is such a thing, an average value to fall. The standard deviation is another number that's used to describe that set of numbers, and it describes the width of that distribution. So it gives you an idea of how surprised should you be when a number shows up which is pretty far away from the mean. So I've got a wonderful document came out a couple of years ago that looked at glucose concentrations in people without diabetes, and they came out with normal values. And the normal value here for glucose was pretty close to, 99. And they express this number, 99 is the average, and then they give you a plus and minus 7. That plus and minus 7 refers to the standard deviation. And the standard deviation, if you imagine a bell curve that you might have seen in school, where the most popular value is right there in the middle, that's the mean value, in this case 99. The plus or minus 7 tells you how steep is the drop-off on either side of that mean value. So in this case, the 99 plus or minus 7, if you were to go up to 106, in other words, the mean plus 1 standard deviation, you would expect to have let's go back and say 99 plus or minus 7. 99 minus 7 is 92. 99 plus 7 is 106. So anywhere from 92 to 106, the expectation is that you would have 2/3 of the values in that pretty narrow range. So if your goal is to have quite a lot of stability, which in general is a good thing, you want that standard deviation to be low. And normal people without diabetes, it is in fact quite low. 99 plus or minus 7 is a very tight distribution. 2/3 of the values fall between 92 and 106.
Okay.
So there's a calculation. We could walk through it if you want.
Please. Yeah, I was just going to tell you that when we're done, and I can say this because this won't go out until after I'm allowed to, but I'm wearing a Dexcom Pro. I have been for a couple of days. And so I can see, I'll be able to look while you're talking and figure out what mine is.
Oh, good. So are you able to see the real-time data or not yet?
No, I see it. It's not blinded. I'm looking at it on my phone.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope you're within 7 points of 99. I hope you're well in the normal range.
I certainly hope so too. But I am. I was really, I have to be honest, as I put it on, I thought I'm doing this so that I can see how a working pancreas attacks things, brings them back, what curves look like. I wanted to see all that because I thought it would make it easier for me to speak to people about using insulin. But at the last second, as I was about to do it, I thought, am I about to find out I have like type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetic or something like that? I was like, maybe, and I just kind of was like, all right, well, if that's the case, it's the case. I'm going to find out. But I think I've been pretty good so far. So luckily.
Well, I hope so. And when we do onboarding, we have people come work for Dexcom, and part of the onboarding process is, hey, look at our product and look at what it does. And of course, it's voluntary, but we say, all right, if you'd like to wear one of these just to know what the experience is like, we can get you set up with one of these. And our expectation is always your glucose values are going to be, let me check, boring. And you're going to have a really smooth ride throughout the day, 99 plus or minus 7. But once in a while, we have people that come back and they say, John, I learned something really interesting. And I say, well, what's that? If I have an entire pizza, I can get my sugar up to 180. And I say, wow, that's abnormal. And so people learn something, even if they don't have a known diabetes, they can learn something about diet and exercise. I went for a long bike ride yesterday and I crashed. I went pretty low, and then I had the Coca-Cola or the sugary drink, and then I saw my sugar zoom back up. So you can learn a lot, and that's a general truism that you can learn a lot just by looking. Yeah. But Scott, I'm pleased that you're wearing one of the CGM sensors, and I hope you learned something.
I really am. I'll tell you already, I had 2 smaller pieces of homemade pizza on Sunday, and 3.5 hours later, I got a push-up from the protein and the fat probably holding the crust of the pizza in my system longer. That was fascinating. And this morning, I had a breakfast that was just a piece of turkey and toast. People are like, "Oh my God, so boring." But I smoked a turkey yesterday. It was so good, John. I wanted to have some sort of breakfast. So I took some turkey and I had a piece of toast this morning. And when I was done, I grabbed a navel orange. And when I ate the orange, it tried really hard to push my blood sugar up. Not immediately, but it was drastic. And my body attacked the drastic rise so much so that I was 74 straight down for a second before I leveled right back out at 80. It was amazing. I went from 74 straight down to 80 and stable in one 5 minute thing. So I saw my body go, "Oh, that's a lot of sugar from that orange." And, he's already put this bread in here, I guess. I obviously don't know exactly how my body's thinking, but the idea was I was starting to push up a little from the bread, not greatly. But then I think when I added the simple sugar, I got a really quick response. So I'm noticing that every time I press with simple sugar, my body comes back more aggressively than it does with more complex carbs.
Boy, that's interesting. And other people have described it to me where they might have some indiscretion. They'll say, "I'm going to have a 24-ounce Mountain Dew." And you slam the sugary beverage and you get this wonderful increase in sugar, which you can feel, and life is wonderful. And then what you described with the orange happens in a very dramatic way, where the insulin kicks in and then the sugar plummets, and then all of a sudden you have the big crash. After the sugar high comes the crash. Yeah. And that I think that's a manifestation of instability. Right. And same thing, I'm going to make a quick little analogy to the cruise control on your car. What I hope for when I engage the cruise control on my car is just a smooth ride. And I don't want the car to be slamming on the throttle and slamming on the brake all the time. Mm-hmm. I just want to be going at 65 all the way home. So I'm very sympathetic to your experience with high amplitude glycemic swings. It's a common thing, especially in the world of type 1 diabetes, where we're all taking insulin.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'll tell you, and then I'm going to let you get back to it. But the other thing that happened that I really didn't expect, but makes total sense, is that for about the first 36 hours I wore it, every time I looked and saw my blood sugar stable, I had a horrible feeling of guilt. It was really interesting because my daughter's had type 1 since she was 2. She's 15 now. I have interactions with tens of thousands of people who have diabetes, and they all would just, they would do anything to have that, and it really impacted me for, in the beginning. I felt very guilty for my pancreas working. It was a weird feeling. So, but I'm sorry, I shouldn't derail you because we're talking about something that's, you don't think is complicated, but trust me, I do. So I shouldn't distract myself. But we were talking again about people, who have a functioning pancreas, and you said, let's pick 99 as that kind of center target, and you can go to 92 or up to 106, and then explain again where were you headed with that?
Oh, sure. The value, I'm looking at a big article that came out a couple of years ago. They looked at 153 people without diabetes, and they put glucose monitors on them, and they collected a bunch of data. And so the question, I guess the first question is, why would you care? Why would anybody bother? The answer is, well, we want to know what normal looks like so we can decide if a particular glucose profile is reassuringly normal or if there's something going sideways on it. The 99 value from earlier is the mean. The standard deviation I gave you earlier is 7, and that tells you something about how wide the distribution is. So one standard deviation on either side of 99 would go from 92 on the low side up to 106 on the high side. That mean plus or minus one standard deviation, the expectation is that 2/3 of the values would fall in that relatively narrow range. 2 standard deviations, 99 plus 14 is 113 on the high side, and then 99 minus 14, I guess, is 85. Is that right? On the low side. So 85 to 113, the expectation is that you would cover an even higher percentage. I think 96% of the values would fall in that range. And if you go out even further to plus or minus 3 standard deviations, the the expectation is that almost all the values, more than 99% of the values, would fall within 3 standard deviations of that central value, the mean. So that's it in a nutshell. The calculation, it's not difficult. It's not trivial, but it's not difficult. I'm not sure if your audience would be interested in walking through it or just looking it up on.
I'll tell you right now, John, this is very much meant to be for people who are interested in that. So I have a group of episodes. There's about 20 of them. They're called Pro Tips, and they are deep dives into specific things about type 1. And this is one. So don't think of this as an interview as much as think of it as we are really trying to pick this apart so that when someone listens through, like, I'll be honest with you. In 6th grade, my guidance counselor told me I could take algebra. Halfway through algebra, I didn't understand algebra at all. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm terrible at math. I dropped out of it. It was a bad decision because I followed a much simpler math track the rest of my time, which probably wasn't necessary. And just now, as you were talking, you set up this scenario and the standard deviation was plus or minus 7. And you started talking about out 1, standard deviation 2 and 3. And it just started to make sense to me. So you're doing a good job.
Okay.
Yeah. Trust me, if I understood what you just said, everyone listening has a chance to understand it as well.
Well, you're very kind, and I'm very pleased to think that we're making progress toward the goal. Then
good.
We can I can introduce the topic again and say the standard deviation is just a number that's used to describe a set of other numbers. The standard deviation, there's a calculation for it. It's a little bit involved, but it involves first of all calculating the mean for a population. The example that we used was the mean value for people without diabetes. It's 99. Mm-hmm. You have quite a lot of values. You might have thousands or tens of thousands of values. And this is where it gets a little bit tedious. For every one of those individual values in the set that you want to describe, you have to calculate the difference from the mean. And the difference from the mean is either going to be a negative number or it's going to be a positive number, depending on whether the individual value is higher or lower than the mean. You square that. So squaring a negative number gives you a positive number. Squaring a positive number gives you a positive number. So you're going to get another set of numbers, which is the squared difference from the mean. And if you had 10,000 values in the set, you're going to have 10,000 squared differences from the mean. You have to add them all up. You get a sum of squared differences, and then you divide it by the number of observations in the set minus 1. So it's pretty complicated when you try to describe it verbally, but if you were to look at it on a sheet of paper, you would say, oh, it's a series of steps. Add up all the squared differences from the mean, divide it by a large number, 1 less than the number of observations in your sample, and then take the square root. And then once you've taken the square root, bingo, there's your standard deviation. So it's a few steps, but it's something that kids probably learn and then probably forget just as quickly as they learned it in middle school or high school algebra class.
So how does the Clarity app, like, to simplify that all down, what is the Clarity app looking at when it tells me, the standard deviation is 35? Can you distill it? What is it looking at to make that decision without the detail?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the statistics page for the Clarity app gives you some summary statistics, and just a quick little operational note. I wonder if you're able to see my page that I'm trying to share with you on the Zoom meeting.
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. So maybe you should ask your question again so we could rejoin the post-editing narrative.
Oh, I was, what I'm interested in is there's a Clarity app, obviously, and and it tells me, oh, your standard deviation or your daughter's standard deviation is 35. Or some people are like, oh, I'm struggling and mine's 65. And I heard from a woman the other day that told me her doctor told her that anything under 100 was okay, which she very smartly was like, I don't think that sounds right. But I want to know, what does it look at to tell me my standard deviation is 34? What is it taking into account?
Oh, sure. Well, that's. I think I can get that one answered pretty quickly. We've got our statistics page, and if your audience wants to look at the Dexcom Clarity web interface, there's a page all devoted to statistics. Looking right now at my statistics for Monday, and this is every Monday for the past 30 days, so there's several Mondays in that sample. I've got a total of 1,253 readings. And each one of those is an estimated glucose value. And then the summary statistics, the minimum 40, that was scary. The maximum 244, so those are not normal. The mean value, 128, that's reassuring. And then the standard deviation, 34. So to get that 34, the calculation that I just walked you through, which is look at every one of those 1,253 values, get the difference from the mean. So do the subtraction 128 minus a particular value. You square each of those differences from the mean, add them all up, and then divide the total by 1,252. And once you've done that, you take the square root of it, and it's 34. So there's, as I said, it's a little bit of algebra, but it's, again, the usefulness of it. 128 plus or minus 34 tells you that you would expect 2/3 of those glucose readings to be within one standard deviation of the mean. So 128 minus 34 is just 90-something, and then 128 plus 34 is 162. So you would expect most of my sugars to be in that range.
Take for a second in any example. I know we're going to oversimplify, but describe what mean is.
Oh, sure. The mean, it's also known as the average value. So if you were to look at the NBA players, you say, wow, NBA players are really tall. You might express that in numbers by saying the average or the mean height of an NBA player is 6 feet 6 inches tall. So it's another word for average. It's a particular kind of average, but we don't need to talk about the other kinds of averages. Mean is usually just the arithmetic mean. Right. You calculate it by adding up all the values and then dividing that total by the number of values.
So what I have here, what I'm looking at in front of me, is 1,253 readings. There were 40 that were. Is that that under a certain number? Those 40?
Oh yeah, we're looking at these rows in the statistics. Mm-hmm. The number of readings 1,253. The bottom, the minimum was 40. The maximum 244. Okay. And the mean value 128.
Gotcha. So within, if I may, within those 1,253 readings, the high was 244, the low was 40, but on average, this person's blood sugar was 128.
That's a nice way to do it, and yeah, we're looking at my readings from the past month or so.
Oh, these are you. Oh my gosh. Are you? Do you have type 1?
I do. I've been living with type 1 for most of my life, for past 45 years, and so far so good.
John, I thought you were showing me like an example page. I didn't realize we were looking at your blood sugars. Well,
yeah, you can spy on me. You can look at my summary statistics here. We can continue with the summary statistics page.
Yeah, and I'm going to have some questions about it when you're done. But please keep going.
Oh, sure. And this is incredibly it's a very useful way to get a numerical description of other numbers. And so far so good. You know, here's a guy, John Welsh. Who is this clown anyway? And what is he doing talking about his glucose numbers? So John's had at least one time where he went all the way down to 40, but the mean value 128 is reassuring. And then we get down to some other statistics that talk about the median value. The median value is the value above which and below which half of the values occurred. So in my case, the median is 122. And that tells you that half of my readings were above 122 and half of my readings were below 122. So that's another measure of central tendency. And it's usually expressed alongside the interquartile range. And so you look at the value that is 75% of the way to the top. So 75% of the values are below it, 25% are above it. And in my case, the 75th percentile is 153. The 25th percentile is 103. So you can say with some confidence that half of my values were between 103 and 153, and those are the 25th and 75th percentiles. And the interquartile range here is given as 50, and that's just the difference between 153 and 103.
Can I ask a question here? If half of those were ranged between 103 and 153, I'm assuming that the other half are how we arrive at the standard deviation of 34. Like, I'm assuming you need that information too to come back to the standard deviation.
Oh, no. No, the standard deviation relies on all values, and it doesn't care so much about the distribution. It just cares about how far from the mean value the values are. Okay. So there's another point that I want to make, which is the median value, in my case, 122. Mm-hmm. The mean value is 128. A lot of times those are very close together, but sometimes they're very far apart. And there's some special circumstances where the mean value is much, much different than the median value. And we can talk about those if you think it's interesting.
I wonder, what I do want to know is how much of sensor, like, so, my daughter's been wearing a Dexcom since 7, maybe Dexcom 7 or 7 Plus back then. And so Great. Obviously we see things at every generation improve and improve and improve. But I could still say that for Arden, in the first number of hours, that you put on a new sensor, it's not as, it's not as tight with its understanding of your blood sugar as it maybe is on, day 2, or or there's a sweet spot through the middle where it's crazy. Mm-hmm. Arden uses a Contour X1 blood glucose meter, which is incredibly accurate. And for a large part of her sensor wear, the meter and the CGM are spot on with each other. They're within a couple of points. And when you're managing type 1, there's a ton of good feeling about that, knowing that, she wakes up in the morning and it says her blood sugar is 96. Now, whether or not her blood sugar is really 85 or it's really, 104, it, to me, is of no real consequence. It's in that space, and I'm thrilled with that. Then I put it on, and I don't have diabetes, and I wake up and it says my blood sugar is 94, and I think, oh my God, I've been fasting all night and I'm 94, and I do a finger stick and I'm 85. It's amazing that those 7 points to a person without diabetes is it's a different impact than it is to a person with it, right? And so
it is.
Seriously, I wake up in the morning, I'm 94, I'm like, well, I guess that's it. I'll just eat lettuce till I die. It's just, it feels like that immediately. And sure. But that same information coming from my daughter, I am completely comforted by, and not just comforted by it, but it leads me in my understanding of how to manage her insulin and to her health and everything. My question is that knowing that the sensor is a little, on the edges, it struggles a tiny bit more than it does in the middle. Is there something about my data that I can't look at too micro? Do I have to, how much time do I really need before the inconsistencies in the data and the consistencies in the data balance out to where it doesn't matter that it's not all perfect? Does that make sense?
Oh, that is a very common question. And I don't have a good answer. I can tell you how I deal with imprecise measurements Please. In my own life. And I had a wonderful bike ride yesterday here in San Diego, and I've got a fancy bike that has a built-in speedometer. It's based on how many times the wheel completes a revolution. So there's a speed sensor built into the wheel, and based on that, you can calculate your speed. And I've got another fancy thing in my phone where you can get your speed based on satellite data from your global positioning satellite system. Mm. And I looked at it and I found myself chugging along the road, and the the speeds, you want to guess if they were exactly the same? No, they weren't.
Right.
I was going 20 miles an hour. If you look at the wheel sensor, I was going 21 miles an hour. If you look at the GPS coordinates. So measuring your blood sugar and seeing one number, and then looking at your CGM and seeing another number, and it's frustrating because there's no good way to know how excited or how concerned to be about discrepancies. There's always going to be discrepancies. It's a rare thing when the blood sugar tells you you're 105, and then you get that 105 from the CGM.
Right.
And I don't want to give medical advice over the phone like this, but there is the possibility that you could calibrate your G6 and based on your confidence in a blood glucose reading, you could say, oh, my G6 is reading a little bit low. I'm going to calibrate it and then bring it back into better alignment with the blood glucose meter. So I know it's frustrating. I wish I had I wish we had better devices for measuring glucose with even more precision.
Dude, are you kidding? They're amazing. You've had diabetes forever. You know how amazing this stuff is. Just because you work there doesn't mean you can't say that. And it's actually been very interesting for me because of the Pro doesn't allow you to calibrate, or at least I just had to go with it. And it really,
sure,
it was interesting to live in the space because for my first maybe 18 hours, the glucose monitor was reading about 10 to 12 points higher than what the finger stick was. It was pretty consistent for those few hours.
Uh-huh.
And I found myself thinking, if this was my daughter and I put a brand new CGM on her that thought she was 110 when she was 91, I'd be like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing ever. I love this thing. It's so amazing. Except, when I didn't have diabetes, I was like, is my pancreas not working? It was just such a very different thing. But beyond that initial feeling, it really did just cement my idea of how much I love this technology. And because I can remember managing my daughter's blood sugar without a glucose monitor, and to think that she'd be stable at 110 or 91 ever for hours and hours at a time is insane. But it would just never happen. But over these last few days, we've been eating the same meals, and her care is so dialed in due in large part to the information that comes back from the Dexcom, that her blood sugars and mine are largely matching before and after meals.
Congratulations. And
cool.
That's wonderful news. And and I'm totally with you. We can talk about the bad old days when you had to make a guess, and a lot of times it was not a very good guess based on just a urine dipstick, and you could say, oh, I'm spilling sugar into my urine and I need more insulin, and you would have to make a guess.
Right.
And some of the highs and lows were pretty scary, and people, sad to say that people are still dying from insulin overdoses. Insulin, let me check, it's a poison, and it can kill you. And there's a lot of downside risk to insulin, even though it's a huge blessing. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of the commercialization of insulin. So we're all going to celebrate and be thankful for the commercialization of insulin and the fact that we're not dead. But it's a tough disease, and you wouldn't wish it on anybody because it's really a lifetime burden. But I'm really pleased.
Thank you. I just had a conversation briefly online with a woman this morning who, even with all the technology, gets incredibly low every day. So I was turning her on to the podcast. I was like, this doesn't need to be. You're not using your insulin correctly, and it's not that difficult to figure out how. So I turned her on some stuff. Listen, I have an idea here. Can I hit you with some questions and see if you have answers to them? These are questions that came from listeners. And
sure.
And I'm not asking you now. I understand you're a doctor, but I'm not asking you that way. I'm asking you based on this information, this data, and how much you've seen it. Do you see information in the data that would help people with the things that they're concerned about? So the first one's simple. Do you know what a non-type 1 standard deviation usually is? Is there a range where it usually falls?
For example, somebody with type 2.
No. Just someone who doesn't have diabetes at all. Do you know where, where?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so we've got we've got some data from a big study of 153 people without diabetes. Their standard deviation was 7.
7. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there, let's see, how do I want to say this here? So this is a type 1 question. Somebody's asking, if there's a lot of variability within the good range, say like 70 to 120, this person's kind of bouncing between 70 and 120. They want to know for their health, and maybe you don't know, but would they be better off sitting at 120 than they would be from going up and down between 70 and 120?
Oh, I think so. And there's this kind of leads into another number that you can get with the summary sheet. The ambulatory glucose profile is something that Dexcom has. It's not exclusive to Dexcom, but it's called the AGP, the ambulatory glucose profile.
What poet names these things, John?
I don't know.
You really got to get a creative in charge of, in medical in general, in charge of the stuff that goes back and touches people. Ambulatory glucose. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There's a lot of syllables there, and there's a whole industry for, if you come up with a new drug, you have to hire a marketing firm to come up with a name for your new drug. But there's a digression for you. Anyway, the numbers. The numbers that are on the top line of the ambulatory glucose profile, the average is there, the time and range is there. There's another number here, which is the standard deviation, and then the coefficient of variation. And that's a number that I think has a lot of usefulness because it tells you how big is your standard deviation compared to the mean value. Mm-hmm. And there's some clinical implications for that. High coefficient of variation is dangerous because it puts you at very much increased risk for dangerously low events, for hypoglycemic misadventures. So the coefficient of variation, again, looking at my own data, for the past 30 days, my coefficient of variation, 31.3. And is that good or bad or indifferent? It's higher than I'd like it, but is it dangerous? And there was a fun article, useful anyways. The useful article came out a couple years ago, and some folks in France and the UK came out with an article in Diabetes Care, and they said CV, coefficient of variation, of 36% is a threshold to distinguish between stable and unstable sugars, because beyond this limit, the frequency of hypoglycemia is significantly increased. And if this, my own CV here, 31.3%, that's reassuring. It's low, which is good, and it's less than 36%, which tells you that I could still go low, but the fact that this CV is less than 36% is reassuring. I went to see my endocrinologist, and he said, "Hey, John, keep up the good work. You're probably not going to die of hypoglycemia before the next time I see you." And that was, so, all right, thanks. We'll see you in 6 months. Yeah.
Well, John, you know what's interesting that I see with my daughter, who is, a woman, a burgeoning woman, is that with our care, the same exact care we use on weeks and days where she's not impacted by hormones, Arden's standard deviation is 24-ish. But,
oh my gosh, that's terrific.
Thank you. But that's not why I'm telling you that. What I'm telling you that is because, although I appreciate it, why I'm telling you is because that when she is impacted with hormones, the run up to her period, for example, her deviation jumps up to 45. And our tools aren't different. Her meals don't vary. It's just she needs more insulin. And it sometimes takes a couple of days for you to realize that that's happening. And then once it's happening, to remember it's happening, to remember my ratios are telling me this much insulin, but it's 4 days before I'm going to get my period. So it needs to be more. It's difficult to recall all that, constantly. But it's fantastic it's interestingly fantastic to see, because if Arden was a boy, I think I would have a son with a standard deviation pretty consistently within 24 until they hit, I'm assuming, puberty as well. But it's just very interesting to look at your 30-day chart here. I know we're talking about it, so you don't mind, but your standard deviation is 42. and you're saying it's not where you want it, but it's also not terrible. Like, people are trying to understand on the outside, what's the number that keeps them healthy, and what's the number where they think, something else is going to happen. It is very simple in people's minds when they think about these numbers. Like, what do I got to hit? How do I get to it?
Yeah. And I think if the more useful number, and I think the one that is very convenient to have as a goal, and is the coefficient of variation, and that's just a ratio. It's the standard deviation divided by the mean. Mm-hmm. And aiming for something less than 36% would be a terrific goal. And if I were still seeing patients, I would say, here's your coefficient of variation is 40%. Let's look more carefully at the trajectories, or at this is called a modal day plot, and I'm sure your audience has seen this. Yeah. It lays out the clock time here on the bottom axis, and then the glucose values on the vertical axis, and you can see the median value here in the bold line right in the middle, and then you can see the shading here. The blue shaded area covers 50% of the values, and then the area in between the dotted lines covers 80% of the values. So what I'm looking for, or what I would be looking for if I were looking at somebody else's plot, is a smooth ride. And sometimes you can identify parts of the day where the ride is pretty bumpy. For example, after lunch, if you're having lunch at your desk and you're not going for a walk and you're having the third slice of pizza, you might see spikes after lunch or dinner. Or you might see plummeting lows after breakfast if you gave yourself too much insulin for breakfast, insulin to go with breakfast. Yeah. So I'm not the standard deviation. If you're always cruising around a relatively high number like 170, the standard deviation is going to be bigger than if you're always cruising around at a much lower number like 110. So the number that I think is more reasonable to target as a therapeutic goal is the coefficient of variation.
Okay. Under 36.
Yeah, that seems to be the magic number, and that's the consensus, and it should be achievable if you just pay attention to parts of the day where you might be having a bumpy ride. You can look at your behaviors, look at the response to your behaviors, and say, you know what, I think I will, instead of having 3 slices of pizza, maybe I'll just have 1. Mm. So CGM can be a wonderful motivator. It can inform people. It can motivate and reward good choices. So you can tell I'm a huge fan. I love evangelizing this stuff. But you can really learn a lot from the numbers, and the numbers can tell you if you pay attention to them, to the numbers themselves, and also to the summary statistics like the standard deviation. You can learn quite a lot from them.
Oh, I'm a huge fan. I don't understand it obviously nearly as well as you do, but I know what it tells me. So, for instance, after Arden's, my poor daughter one day is going to listen back to this and be like, "How much did they talk about my period on that podcast?" But so the lead up to her period, there's like 3 or 4 days prior to it, she gets, all of a sudden she needs way more insulin, and then in the first day or two of it. It happens still, but then there's a moment where it levels, like whatever happens is done. The period's still happening, but the hormonal impact seems to be gone out of her body. So let me give you an example, because it just happened yesterday for her. In the last 24 hours, Arden's estimated A1C is 5, and her standard deviation is 24. Her average blood sugar is 98. But if I just go back 7 days through her, through this lead up to this period, estimated A1C 5.8, standard deviation 43, average blood sugar 119. It's just the hormones. It's the lead up to her period. And so it's fascinating. And not that you don't know, and then there's another time of the month where it happens again to her for 4 or 5 days. But just that week and then that other chunk. So basically what I think is about 7, 8, 9, probably 12 or 13 days of the month takes what would normally be, I think, an SD, and like I said, in the mid-20s, and an A1C closer to 5 than 6, and it moves her A1C more towards like her A1C pretty much sticks at like 5.6. It doesn't move very much.
Okay.
It's just very, I don't know. Like, I don't know what I would do before this information. Like, no lie, prior to it, I wasn't a different person, and we were not good at this at all. Just diabetes in general. Her A1Cs were in the 8s, and then I finally got them into the 7s just by having, better tools, an insulin pump and a glucose monitor. But I still didn't understand it enough to turn it into real, like, success. Like the idea of knowing when to bolus and that sort of thing. But I know all that from this data now, and it's incredibly beneficial.
Absolutely. Well, I'm with you 100% on that, and I think for my own experience was in the bad old days before CGM. I was poking my finger and making a lot of guesses, and it really got me interested in how the body works, and it was a great motivator all through college, and that was part of my story when I was applying to medical school. And I'm not alone. There's a lot of physicians who specialize in endocrinology and metabolism who also have type 1 diabetes. So my own story is, hey, this is really interesting. I want to learn about it, and I want to go to medical school. And what do you know? The medical school here in town said, all right, come to medical school, and you can learn quite a lot in medical school about the disease itself and about how you measure sugar and measure all the other important things that we care about in metabolism.
Yeah.
So it's, for me anyway, it was not just a life-changing event when I got that diagnosis, but it also defined my career path toward becoming a physician and also to working here at Dexcom.
Yeah. Hey, so that's fascinating, and I'm afraid I'm going to start talking to you and then lose track of what we're supposed to be doing, because I had questions and I almost asked them, and I was like, "Oh, don't do that." What kind when this data is pulled together, given that there are blood sugar lags and meters aren't perfect and nothing's perfect, what's built in to deal with the error? To, like, how does it come to the number and take the impreciseness out of it? Is it like looking at yours for an example? Your standard deviation is 42. What if a Dexcom was absolutely perfect? If there was if it wasn't technology, but it was your I don't know, something organic that could know 100% for sure what all these measurements are in your glucose all the time, how far off do you think that number would be if you had perfection? Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. You're hypothesizing that there's
a real answer.
Yes. There does exist some true number, and we're always trying to become more accurate and getting closer to that true number.
Right.
We're never going to get there. You have to stipulate that. We're always going to have some wiggle and some imprecision, and that's, I think, true because nothing on this planet is perfect, and we have to. If we get to heaven, then everything is perfect in heaven if we ever make it there.
I'll ask them. That'll be my first question when I get there. I'll be like, what was my kid's A1C really?
Yeah, so that's a whole nother line of inquiry. But we're probably certainly within 10%. I think I'm confident that we're within 10%. I'm less confident that we're within 5%. I would be surprised if we were within 3%, and I would be really astonished if you told me it was within 1%. I would be astonished. So I've got some confidence for the 10% precision, and I've got some optimism that we can usually get within 5% of the true value. Those are just speculative numbers because there's no such thing as a perfect value. Even if you use the gold standard, we could quibble about any reference instrument. And this is one of the things they drilled into us during my residency training in laboratory medicine, which is there such a thing as a perfect measurement? No, not until we all die and go to heaven. Right. While we're living on this earth, you have to deal with imprecision and uncertainty. But I think we're pretty good. And for purposes that we care about, managing diabetes and living a long, happy life, I think we're well within the realm of good enough.
And outcomes are good based on what we know. Does that mean, from what you just said, if at a 42 standard deviation, is it possible that your standard deviation is somewhere like 36 or possibly like, I don't know, 48 or 47, or is it more likely it's lower or more likely it's higher? Is there a likelihood that it's more one way than the other?
Oh yeah, the standard deviation just tells you how spread out the distribution is, and the true standard deviation could be higher or lower because all the numbers that the standard deviation depends on could actually be incorrect. So I think that's a tough one. Let me think about that.
Yeah, please.
I'm looking now at this. Looking now at the standard deviation and this the famous bell curve. You know what, if I'm understanding your question correctly, could the standard deviation be something different?
Use me as an example in my situation right now. If I put on a new CGM every 10 days, I wear 3 sensors a month, 9 sensors over a 3-month period. If I look back at my 90 days, my standard deviation, if my sensor's reading just 10 points higher for the first, I don't know, just say 36 hours of every one of those things, am I more likely to look higher than I am or lower than I am because of that? Higher, right?
Yeah, I think you would have a high. It's called a high bias.
Okay.
But your earlier question, could the standard deviation be something other than the calculated result? I think the answer is no. If you gave me the numbers from 1 to 5, could the total be something other than 15? And I would say no. The total of the integers from 1 to 5 is 15. And if you give me a set of numbers, I can calculate the mean and the standard deviation. So I think the calculation that we've done here, resulting in this standard deviation of 42, if we did the math correctly, then the standard deviation is 42.
Does the algorithm that's making this decision, does it scrub anything? Like, like a compression load? Does it see that and go, oh, we're not going to take this into account? Does it do any of that kind of stuff?
Oh yeah, and I think that's true. That's got to be true for Medtronic. It's got to be true for Abbott. It's got to be true for Senseonics and also for Dexcom. We've got algorithms. The signal that we are measuring is actually a voltage. It's a current. So the current is very low. Current usually measured in amperes, and we're dealing with billionths of an ampere, I think a nanoampere or picoamperes, so incredibly small currents. And the challenge for the engineers is to take that very small electrical current and translate that into a number that makes sense, a number of milligrams per DL. So that requires some engineering talent, and it requires an algorithm. And I think that's part of the secret sauce that we have here at Dexcom. Medtronic, I'm sure they have a algorithm which is similar but slightly different, and the same for Abbott and the same for Senseonics. And that's true whenever you're measuring something and saying what you're measuring. For the example of your oven, if you're cooking making your cookies, you're measuring temperature. What you're really measuring is the height of the mercury in the thermometer. And the trust is that that's a good representation of your temperature. And then going back to the bicycle speedometer example, what it's really measuring is how fast the wheel is turning, and you're translating that revolutions per minute into a speed. So it's a challenge to take a very small electrical current and turn it into a glucose value, but that's what we do, and I think that's what all the manufacturers have to do.
It's amazing. And listen, we're one rabbit hole away from wondering if we live in a simulation. So let me ask a more concrete question.
I'm ready.
John, in 30 more minutes, we're going to be like, we're probably in the Matrix. Sure. Just a real quick one. Canadians or people who are using other scales, did they multiply their standard deviation by 18 to get their answer? Like this person gave me an example, said their last standard deviation in Canada was 1.6. Do they multiply that by 18 to get the number that the way we're talking about it right now?
They sure would, yeah. So the units for standard deviation, the standard deviation here in the U.S. is milligrams per DL. Outside the U.S., the standard deviation is millimoles per liter, and the conversion factor is 18.
Okay.
So the standard deviations would be less by a factor of 18 in places where they use millimoles per liter. And that's a good point. Thank you for bringing it up. And the point is that what would not change is the coefficient of variation. So if you were to take all my numbers, or if I were lucky enough to be a Canadian and measuring my sugars in millimoles per liter, I would still have this coefficient of variation of 31.3%. That would not change.
I see.
Because you're dividing milligrams per DL in the numerator, milligrams per DL in the denominator, and those units would cancel them out. Coefficient of variation, there's no units for that. It's just a percentage.
I'm glad you said that, or some person in Saskatchewan was going to take their coefficient and multiply it by 18 and panic. No, that's great to know. And thank you for knowing it, by the way, when I asked the question. I appreciate that.
Oh, it's a good one. You know, if you were to travel to Japan, you would trade your dollars for yen, and you would find yourself 100 times more wealthy, because you can buy about 100 yen with $1. But wait, everything's 100 times more expensive. So,
well, so let me make sure I'm understanding exactly. So, coefficient of variation we're talking about under 36 really lessens your possibility of low blood sugars. Standard deviation shows us how much stability we have, right? Like our keeping our variability lower. What is A1C measuring?
Oh,
like in terms of our health.
Oh yeah, A1C. There's I love A1C. I want to strangle it and drown it in a bathtub. A1C has been with me for a long time. It's a biomarker. It's hemoglobin, obviously, is the protein that fills up your red cells. It's got the red color because it's got iron in the middle of it. It's got an iron atom, and it's the same color as rust. The hemoglobin A1C, the A part of it refers to the A chain. There's an A chain and a B chain. The hemoglobin A1 refers to the first amino acid in the A chain of hemoglobin, and the C refers to the isoform. If you want to know, it refers to the isoform of altered hemoglobin that travels on chromatography. Anyway, that's the long answer. The short answer is that hemoglobin A1C is a abnormal form of hemoglobin that has a sugar atom stuck onto it. And having that sugar atom, it's a sugar molecule, stuck onto it. And it's a nice indicator of how your ambient glucose concentrations have been going over the past 2 or 3 months. The downside of having a high A1C is that hemoglobin A1C molecules behave a little bit differently, and they're also markers that things are going haywire in other parts of your body. Other proteins in your vasculature, in your kidneys, and your liver might be getting decorated with sugar molecules when they really shouldn't be. Mm. So having a very high hemoglobin A1C number tells you that quite a lot of your hemoglobin molecules are traveling around with this kind of gooey, sticky sugar molecule stuck onto them. As I mentioned earlier, it's not my favorite biomarker. What's your favorite biomarker, John? There's ways that you can fool the hemoglobin A1C test, and we can talk about those. There's some people have problems with red cell production or red cell destruction that would throw it off. So you can really be misled by an A1C number. It can be too low, and you can say, you're doing just fine. Your A1C is in the normal range when it should be much higher. And then on the flip side, you can see an A1C. Some people have A1C values that are unexpectedly high compared to what their average glucose values are. So it can mislead you in a couple of different ways. I'm a much more enthusiastic about just using the average glucose value that you get from a CGM system to assess the adequacy of your glycemic control.
Is that okay? It's interesting. You made me think of last year. My ferritin was very low, and at first the doctors thought I had cancer, and we did all these things, and it turns out I just had low ferritin. And so I got an infusion of what do they call it? It's I can't think of it now. It's iron, and it's a mix. It looks like a rusty bag of water, and it popped it back up. But during that time, what I was told was we can't trust your A1C right now because of your low ferritin. And I was like, huh. And I didn't dig too deeply into it, but something you just said now made me think of it again. And then it made me think about how, measurements, right? And you always get, you could use anything as an example. My daughter has hypothyroidism, but when we first figured it out by her symptoms, the doctor's office looked and said, well, she's low, but she's in range. We don't want to do anything. And we made them give her, the hormone then because we had an experience with my wife who was low in range and they would never help her. And it really hurt her over time. And so it made me wonder, especially for, women in a menstruation age, is it possible that they have an A1C that looks better than it is if they have lower ferritin? Just like
there you go.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. That's another of all the ways that A1C could be misleading.
That's one.
That's one of them. And I'm thinking, my own experience. I used to be a really avid blood donor, and I thought, oh, you know what? If I were to donate 2 units of blood, and then wait around for a couple of weeks, and then get my A1C measured, that would falsely lower the A1C because as soon as I donate 2 units of blood, my bone marrow is going to wake up and say, oh my gosh, John, you did something either stupid or crazy or really altruistic by donating those 2 units of blood. We have to ramp up production, and we're going to flood your system with brand new red cells. So after 2 weeks after donating the blood, I would have a population of red cells which were relatively young and had not had a chance to get glommed onto by the sugar molecules, and my A1C would be falsely low. And I say, yep, I can sure game the system that way. And that's the same for people who undergo acute blood loss. The A1C would be falsely decreased within a couple of weeks once the red cell production line kicks into gear. And then people who have shortened red cell lifespans, there's some conditions, a lot of syllables, but hemoglobinopathies. If your red cells are not up to the task, and if they're prematurely destroyed, you would have a very low A1C, and it would be misleading if you were trying to manage diabetes based on that.
No kidding. So you as a person who's had type 1 for a long time and is a physician, and I think we didn't really dig into it, but it sounds like you used to help people with type 1 as well when you were practicing. Is that right?
Oh, indirectly, I specialized in laboratory medicine and also anatomic pathology. So I would look at disease and I would measure disease, and then I went to anyway. So I never directly took care of people who were who needed insulin management.
But for yourself, then let me just ask yourself. Then I guess it makes more sense. With your background and how much time you spend digging around in this data, how do you measure your success? Like, which one of these, I know there's going to be a grouping of them here, but can you tell me what you look at every time you look at your data, just to, when you want to look and go, oh, I need to do a little more, a little less, like what is it where do you focus? And is there any way to put them in descending order?
Oh, well, I'm getting old. If you wait long enough, everybody's going to get old. I used to worry quite a lot about my A1C, and now I really don't care. What I focus on mostly is the average glucose, and the example that we're looking at now is 133, which is wonderful. And beyond that, I try not to rank myself. I try not to compare myself to my peers. Here at Dexcom, we've got some very talented folks with type 1 who are even more dialed in than I am. If it seems like I know what I'm doing, there's people down the hall who are even better, and then there's people in the community who are need some advice, and that's the mandate. I say, you know what, I'm doing fine, but let's see if there's problems that I can address. So I look at my average sugar. I look at the time high and low, time in range. In the example that we're looking at, 85.9% is pretty good. And then I also look at the amount of trouble and strife that it causes me, and I try to minimize that. I try to settle in on a good routine that doesn't cause me too much trouble and strife. And finally, after 45 years, I think I've found a good routine for managing my own diabetes.
That's amazing. That's, I think, what people need to hear too. It's funny, as you were saying all that, I was looking at my daughter's 90, like I went to 90 days on her information because you said average blood sugar, and
yeah,
her average blood sugar has been 115 over the last 90 days with an estimated A1C 5.6, but her standard deviation over that time is, like I said, it's 45. And should I be more concerned about that?
Well, here's an important question, and it relates to the time that she spends really low, and I wonder if there's numbers for either time less than 70 or time less than 54, because those are things that can cause trouble in a hurry.
Yeah,
being less than 54 is kind of dangerous.
I have her range set as 65 to 120. She's 9% low, 54% in range, and 37% high. But she does not get, for the most point, we don't go over about 180 ever. And under 55, I don't think happens twice a month, maybe. And not for long periods of time. Not like under 55 and falling where people are running around the house, looking for the will and stuff like that. Just, like a dip down that you caught a little too late, and it'll go to 55 and hang and come back up. But yeah, we don't let her sit under that number. But I look at her standard deviation all the time, and I'm always just like, that's where I need to do better. But like I said, for half of the month, that standard deviation is 24. And then during her, her hormonal times throws that number off. Like, is that number less scary because she's a girl than it would be if she was a boy? I know that's a weird question, but because of, you know what I mean?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to take issue with your premise. What you told me is that number scary? And I don't think so. I don't think that's a scary number at all. Just based on the fact that she is so dialed in that she has almost continuous awareness of where she is, and she's got good access to her family and to you, and good access to candy if she needs it. So it doesn't sound like she's in harm's way at all. The thing that there's some things that are absolutely dangerous. One is going low and finding yourself waking up with a crowd of people trying to resuscitate you is a terrible misadventure because you went low and you ignored the symptoms, and guess what? You had a seizure, you lost consciousness, you bonked your head, and now the EMTs are out. That's a scary misadventure. So I think if and you told me earlier she's had it for quite a long time.
She was diagnosed when she was 2, and she's going to be 16 next month.
Okay, so 14 years into it. Hopefully, all the autonomic counter-regulatory hormones are intact, and I hope they stay that way. So the hypoglycemia awareness, I hope, is fully intact, and the counter-regulatory hormones that would kick in to bring her sugar back toward the normal range, I hope are intact. The coefficient of variation, you mentioned earlier the standard deviation for your daughter, and remind me of the coefficient of variation.
Oh, let me get it for you. It does similarly change with what's happening in her. I have it at 90 days as 39%. In the last
and 39.
In the last week, 36%. But if I go into just the last 3 days, where, like I said, the impact from her hormones is gone, it's 30%.
Oh, okay. Wow. So sometimes it gets above that arbitrary number of 36%. So there's some stretches of time where the variability is in excess.
And it's important to note that, so my daughter now for over 6 years has had an A1C between 5.2 and 6.2, and we don't restrict her diet in any way. So she'll have pancakes, for breakfast on a Sunday morning, just as easily as this morning. Like I said, she had, an avocado toast. And so, she's all over the place with what she eats. She'll have nights where she just has a big salad for dinner and nothing else. Last night she had some turkey and a small amount of potatoes, but when dessert came out, she wasn't interested. And so I would call her eating healthy and varied, and not excessive. She's not a sweets person. Like she'll trick or treat, but that's to hang out with her friends, and she comes home and doesn't know what to do with the candy. Like that's sort of an idea. But I'm trying to talk through her to everybody so that everybody can kind of get a feeling for how they should feel about this information for themselves personally.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, there are some things, and we spend a lot of time looking at data here. We've got some data science people who built their career on looking at data. There's a couple of comments that might be helpful, and one is to look for opportunities to lower the standard deviation, lower the coefficient of variation. One is to see if there's any evidence of overtreating highs or lows. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those really jump out. If you look at the hourly plot, we call it the modal day plot.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll see, here's something where I know where I went sideways on this. I know I had the big snack after lunch I shouldn't have. Oh, there were free donuts in the conference room. I should have said no to those donuts. So sometimes there's opportunities for looking at your data, not the numbers, but just looking at the image of the 24-hour stretch of daytime. You say, wow, there's a big spike there in the early morning hours. Maybe I had too much snack before I went to bed. Maybe I had too much. My own case, I had a habit of taking too much fast-acting insulin to cover breakfast, and I would always go low around 9 o'clock in the morning. Mm-hmm. So looking at the data, not just as numbers, but as a graph, can be very helpful, and it can reveal opportunities for making adjustments. And if the standard deviation is in the high range, if the coefficient of variability is in the high range, then it deserves some careful consideration about, wow, this is a bumpy ride. Are there any particular times of the day that you would like to address with your and might be really amenable to making thoughtful changes?
Can I ask, given how the numbers are calculated, how much is at all? What's my question? Are any of the numbers based off of the range that I've set up? So keeping in mind that my daughter's range is, on my phone, it's 65 to 120. On her phone, I think it's 70 to 130. And so on her phone, which is the one that, her Clarity account's connected to and everything, if my daughter's blood sugar is quite literally between 75 and 110 for 2/3 of the day, but she has two big meals that spike her to 180, but she's not at that 180 for more than an hour and comes back down without getting low. Do those numbers look artificially inflated if that's how it works for her sometimes?
I think your question is, what are the numbers that you see in the Clarity report or the Clarity summary? And the time in different ranges, you can set those. You can customize the ranges that you want to see for, and you can do that in the daytime and the nighttime.
So
ranges that
if I changed her range, this might be a stupid question, but if I pushed my daughter's high number up to 180, would her standard deviation fall?
No, it would not.
Okay.
No, the standard deviation doesn't care whether a number is in the range that you set is pretty arbitrary. You can turn that dial up or down. The range that you set within Clarity just tells you when are you going to get beeped and what are the summary statistics for time and range going to look like.
None of the data is based off of those ranges. Got it.
That's right.
Great.
That's right. The standard deviation, coefficient of variation, those numbers are not subject to change by just changing the alerts or the target ranges.
I see. Okay. And they're based off of what quote unquote normal would be. Is that right?
Oh, actually not. The normal range I mentioned earlier, the normal range is no more than 120. Okay. And at the moment, I'm just leaning over and checking my sugar right now. It's 109. But for the most part, having a sugar of 150 would not be concerning, I don't think, for any endocrinologist. If you were to cruise around at 150 all day, every day, the endocrinology community would say you're doing a good job. Your A1C is likely close to 7%, and your risk of long-term complications is close to baseline, close to what the non-diabetic population would have. So that would be very reassuring, even if you're having a abnormally high glucose number. I got a call once. I did some lab tests and for a different occasion, and the nurse called me up and said, "John, I've got some very concerning news. Your glucose is 123." And I thought, well, what's concerning about that? and she said, well, it's higher than normal. And I said, well, I have type 1 diabetes. And as soon as she heard the fact that I had type 1 diabetes, she said, oh, well, you're boring. Have a nice day. Goodbye.
So you're making me think of my daughter had to give urine one time, and I left the room where I dropped it off and didn't tell the nurse she had diabetes. And I walked halfway down the hall and ran back because I was worried for the nurse, and she was running out of the room at the same time. And I looked at her and I went, she has type 1. And she goes, oh, okay. And then she goes back in the room. Let me re-ask my question because I have it in my mind, and maybe I might ask another dumb question here. Trust me, it's very possible.
I'm ready.
So Arden's blood sugar does sit in the 80s for most of the time. But
sure.
And like I said, sometimes she'll hit 180 on a couple of meals. What if her blood sugar always sat at 120 and sometimes hit those 180s? Would that make her standard deviation lower?
I don't think, I don't know. I don't think you've given me enough information to ask that question. We could do some numerical simulations, which would be interesting, but maybe quite a digression. I don't think we can tell for sure just based on what you told me. So it's a big question mark right now. I'd have to punt and say I don't know.
That's fine. I can't wrap my head around my own question, which is frustrating, as you may imagine, and a limitation of my intelligence. But I'm trying to decide how, so you don't, I know you've heard a couple episodes of the show, John, but you don't listen to the show. And I actually would like to send you a short list of episodes and let you listen to them and hear what you think of them. But most of the people who listen to this podcast, I would assume, have an A1C in the 5s, or I would think over 6.5 for somebody who's been listening more than 3 months would be uncommon. And
wow.
the basic tenet of the podcast is that you don't stare at a high blood sugar. You get it back down without causing a low. And there's ways to use insulin, with the data that makes that work. So we're pretty heavily talking here about make sure your basal insulin's right, pre-bolus your meals, don't stare at a high blood sugar, don't cause a low, bump and nudge with insulin. If you, after a meal, at a meal time, 45 minutes after you eat, if you're 136 diagonal up, we bump it back down again. If you're 85 diagonal down, that turns into 80, that you think, ooh, this is going to keep going, you don't wait to see a 60. You take in a few carbs and nudge that blood sugar back up again. It's like driving between two lines. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to swerve. You just want to kind of try to stay as steady as possible. And we talk a lot about how to use insulin, temporary basal rates, both positive and negative, and food in ways that keep those swings from being crazy. And Yet there are people who come back with amazing A1Cs who don't get low very often, but have a couple of spikes with larger meals. And these numbers that everyone's telling them are super important, standard deviation, they can't seem to get into the space that they want. And then they start thinking about limiting food to make that happen. And I think this podcast has a lot of different goals, but one of them is for you to understand insulin enough that you can eat what you want to eat. And I'm not saying that everyone should run out and eat those donuts at the conference table. Like, that's not my point. My point isn't, I'm not a person who says, oh, you have diabetes, don't ever think about your health. Just eat whatever you want because insulin can take care of it. My point is that if you understand how to use insulin, then you can go off into the world and with a diet of your choosing, keep your blood sugars in a more normal range and extend your health. But I'm baffled a little by my daughter's standard deviation. All the other numbers make sense to me, but that one number I can't wrap my head around. That's all.
Yeah, and you mentioned the hormonal changes that come by every month, and sometimes the good control becomes more of a challenge, obviously, and the coefficient of variability goes up, and then unfortunately, having a high coefficient of variation gives you a higher risk of symptomatic or potentially dangerous lows. But so it's especially important to have that awareness of misadventures on the low side, especially during that time of the month where the swings are especially high amplitude.
Yeah.
But the goal is, as you said, I think the goal is to spend most of your time out of harm's way and to live a long, happy life where your retinas last your whole life, and your kidneys are going to last your whole life, and you're going to die with all 10 of your toes where they belong at the end of your feet. So it sounds like she's well on the way, and especially the education that you've been giving her and the insights that she's been getting from CGM.
I agree.
Sound like they've been tremendously helpful.
I appreciate it. John, I just did something that I feel badly about, but because you're sharing your screen, I can't see my screen, and I just realized that I've had you on for an hour and 20 minutes. I'm so sorry. I am really enjoying this, and I didn't recognize about the passage of time. I hope I haven't kept you from something. You're not just being polite to me.
Well, let me, I think I had something I did have something else on the calendar, and I hope I'm not, let me check my little Outlook here. You can see my calendar. There's something coming up at noon, so maybe we ought to. I'm
going to let you go, is what I was going to say. Yeah, 100%. I just looked at my phone to look at something about Arden to say to you, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're going to crucify me. I've had you way too long. Listen, this was incredibly interesting, and I can't really thank you enough for doing it because it's not something everyone jumped up to do. And I said, can I get somebody who really understands standard deviation to talk on the podcast? There wasn't a long line of people with their hand up, so I genuinely appreciate this. And I have to tell you, it's going to go right out tomorrow. I don't usually put stuff out this quickly, but this fits right into my schedule. So you'll be able to hear yourself and be horrified by your own voice in probably 12 hours or so.
Well, that's great. So you can. I hope you cut out the obscenities and the screaming and the lawnmowers and
all that horrible stuff you did will be cut out. Now people will just hear you say that and wonder what it is that we took out.
Scott, what a pleasure. I enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for reaching out. And Dexcom is great. I'm just surrounded by really smart people who love. Who are really bought into the mission. It's a good company, it's a good product, it's a good mission, and it's nice hearing about your own experience and your daughter as well. I hope you have a long, happy life with this thing that nobody wants, but we're doing the best we can with type 1 diabetes.
You're very nice, John, but to think that you're not going to get drugged back on this podcast at some point is not reasonable. I'm going to get you back here at some point. We'll find out more about you and your diabetes one day. I really appreciate this. I'm going to be incredibly humble all day long after talking to you, just so you know. I realize that
you're the god of podcasts, though. You can go have some podcast swagger and brag about having a wonderful podcast.
Well, I'll have to lean on that since I couldn't get out of algebra in 6th grade. So thank you very much.
Okay, cheers. Have a good rest of your afternoon now.
You too. I know that was a denser episode than you're accustomed to on this podcast. But I just thought that having someone like John walk through these ideas was important. I took a ton from it. I'm going to listen back to this a couple of times because I'm not as smart as I need to be sometimes about some of this stuff. But John made it understandable and complete. I was really thrilled to have him on. I'm going to have him back someday and just talk about him and his diabetes and try to learn his story. I wish you could have heard the conversation I had with my booker when I was like, hey, I need somebody from Dexcom to talk about standard deviation, like really deep dive. Is there somebody over there that can do that? And she was like, I'll find out. And boom, John Welsh comes out of nowhere. Really lovely man. I want to thank you for listening. I mean, especially if you're still here an hour and a half into this, you are a major geek about diabetes data, and I love you for it. Thanks so much to Omnipod, Touched by Type 1, the Contour Next One blood glucose meter, and Dexcom for sponsoring this episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Please, again, go to juiceboxpodcast.com for those links, or look right into the show notes of your podcast player. You can clicky on them right there. One way or the other, if you use my links, you'll let the sponsors know that you came from the Juicebox Podcast, and I will, of course, really appreciate that. Hope you're all well, especially in these times. I'm thinking of all of you, and I'll see you soon.